In the spring of 1878, the town of Cutter's Notch sold off the last of the played-out Hollis mining camp at auction, and nobody wanted it. The shafts had gone dry of silver 3 years before. The bunkhouses had caved their roofs under 2 winters of snow. The saloon still stood, barely, its sign hanging by one nail, and behind it the ground dropped away into a low, wet hollow that every rancher in the valley called Widow's Bowl, because water pooled there in spring and swallowed anything planted in it. The auctioneer took bids on the whole parcel, 210 acres, 11 collapsed structures, 1 intact saloon, and Widow's Bowl included. And when the bidding stalled at $9, a woman named Ruth Calloway raised her hand, and it was hers. She was 31 years old, widowed the winter before, with 1 trunk, a dog named Cinder, and a mule too old to sell. The men at the auction laughed, not unkindly, the way men laugh at a thing they've already decided is foolish. Old Tobias Kearns, who ran the feed store and had bid on the parcel himself only to drop out at $4, told her plainly that she'd bought the worst $9 worth of land in the territory. Bull floods every April, he said. Nothing roots in it. Man who built that saloon lost his shirt and his sense both. Ruth thanked him for the information and said she'd take her chances. She moved into the saloon because it had the only whole roof. The first week, clearing rat nests from the back storeroom, Cinder pawed at a section of floorboard that sounded hollow under her boot heel. Beneath it was a trapdoor, and beneath the trapdoor, a tunnel mouth sealed with a padlocked iron grate, rusted orange but sound. It took her 3 days of soaking the lock in coal oil to get it open. The tunnel ran back nearly 90 feet into the hillside, shored with timber cribbing that had held without a single sag in however many years it had sat forgotten. Along the near wall, someone had built a series of small stone-lined channels, no wider than a hand, cut at a downward pitch and packed with gravel. At the far end, in a dry alcove above the waterline, she found a tin box, and in the tin box, a leather journal, the pages foxed but legible, signed inside the cover. E. Voss, mining engineer, Hollis Camp, 1861. Elias Voss had come to the Hollis Camp not for silver, but because the camp's owners had hired him to solve their flooding problem before it swallowed the shaft entrances. His journal was not a diary of longing or complaint. It was a record of measurements. He had noted the water tables rise after every storm, in inches, over 2 full seasons. He had sketched the hillside in cross-section, showing how the spring melt above Widow's Bowl traveled underground through a seam of porous shale before pooling at the surface. His solution, drawn in careful ink, was what the frontier men of his trade called a cribbed relief tunnel, a bored passage set below the water table, shored with squared timber frames spaced at 4-foot intervals, its floor cut with a network of weep channels lined in gravel to draw the water sideways into the tunnel rather than letting it rise into the bowl above. The tunnel didn't stop the water. It redirected it, patiently, into a lower drainage that fed a dry wash a quarter-mile east, while clear of any structure. Voss had finished the tunnel in the spring of 1862. Then the silver vein gave out that same year. The camp emptied within 18 months, and whatever became of Voss himself, Ruth never learned. But his tunnel had gone on working in the dark and the silence for 16 years, holding back a flood no one living remembered was even threatened. She began repairing what the years had loosened. The first channel she recut. In June of that first summer, she cut too shallow, and a hard rain 3 weeks later proved it. Water backed up into the... Tobias Kearns came by that August, not out of kindness but curiosity, and stood at the tunnel mouth with his hat in his hands, unconvinced. Water always wins in the end, he told her. It always finds you. Ruth didn't argue with him. She showed him the channel, the pitch of it, the gravel pack, and let him believe what he wanted to believe. By the second spring, she had recut 4 of Voss's original 9 channels and begun digging a 10th of her own, following his cross-section notes to extend the drainage further south, where a second seam of shale ran beneath what had once been the camp's assay office. Her nearest neighbor, a quiet blacksmith named Amos Pruitt who had bought 40 acres east of the bowl the same season she'd bought her $9 worth, helped her haul timber for the shoring without being asked twice. He didn't say much. He came, he worked, he left before dark. His presence across those years became as steady as the tunnel itself. The town, meanwhile, watched and mostly waited to be right. Kearns told anyone who'd listen that the widow at Hollis Camp was pouring good labor into a hole in the ground. He wasn't cruel about it. He simply believed it, the way a man believes the sun sets in the west, and he said so at the feed store counter often enough that it became a kind of local joke. Ruth's folly, some called it, though never to her face. The warning signs came in the third winter. Snowfall that year ran nearly double the average, and by February the old-timers were already predicting a hard melt. Ruth read Voss's notes on flood years. He had recorded two, in 1859 and 1861, each preceded by exactly this kind of winter, and she and Amos spent the cold months widening the lower drainage wash, clearing brush and deadfall that had choked it since Voss's time, so the water would have somewhere to go once it left the tunnel. The flood came in April of the third year, at the 2-year and 11-month mark since Ruth had bought the camp. Warm rain fell on 3 feet of snowpack for 4 days straight, and the whole valley ran with meltwater. Cutter's Notch flooded its main street. 2 ranches lost fence lines and livestock to the current. And Widow's Bowl, which every soul in the territory believed would swallow itself and the saloon along with it, held. It held because the tunnel drank the water Voss had designed it to drink. Ruth and Amos worked the tunnel mouth in shifts for 2 days and 2 nights, clearing silt that clogged the channel intakes as fast as it built, repacking gravel where the current scoured it loose, shoring a cribbing joint that groaned under the pressure until Amos wedged a new timber brace against it by lantern light, with water rising past his knees. On the second night, Tobias Kearns's own grandson, a boy of 9 sent to fetch help for a stranded wagon on the low road, got swept off his feet crossing what had been a dry gully that morning. Amos heard him over the water and hauled him out by the collar not 30 yards from the tunnel's drainage outlet, half drowned and shaking, but alive. Ruth wrapped the boy in her own coat and sat with him by the tunnel mouth until the worst of the water passed, checking the channels every quarter hour by lantern, the way Voss's note said a man must during a flood event. Not once, not twice, but continuously, until the water table read falling on the stick she'd driven into the bowl to measure it. By the 4th day the rain stopped, and the water in Widow's Bowl had dropped to nothing more than a wide, muddy sheen. The saloon stood dry. Every structure Ruth had rebuilt stood dry. Down in Cutter's Notch, men were still pumping water out of the mercantile. Tobias Kearns came up to the camp a week later, this time without his hat off, and without much to say at all. He looked at the tunnel mouth a long while. He looked at his grandson, healthy and running around with Cinder in the yard. Then he told Ruth, gruffly, that he'd send his hired man up in the fall to help with whatever digging she had left. He did not say he'd been wrong. He simply started showing up. The years after moved differently than the years before. Where the front of Ruth's story had been measured in single seasons and single storms, the years that followed were measured in seasons that blurred together, in slow accumulations no one event could claim credit for. 2 years after the flood, Amos Pruitt's niece came to live with him, a girl of 12 named Josephine, orphaned when her parents' wagon went off a ford crossing the Bitterwater River 2 counties north. She was quiet in the way Ruth herself had once been quiet, watchful rather than withdrawn, and she took to following Ruth up to the tunnel most afternoons, first out of nothing better to do, then out of something closer to purpose. Ruth taught her to read a water table stick. She taught her the pitch a channel needed, 1 inch of drop to 6 feet of run, the number as fixed in Ruth's mind now as her own name, and why a shallower cut would fail no matter how well built the timber above it. Josephine was 13 when she recut her first channel unsupervised, and it held through that spring's runoff without a single backup. Old Cinder died in the 5th winter, quietly, by the hearth, and Ruth buried her at the tunnel mouth under a flat stone. The following spring a stray hound wandered up from the notch and wouldn't leave, and Josephine named him Ledger, half as a joke about the mining journal, half because he never left Ruth's heel from that day on. The old mule had died the winter before that. Amos brought up a young horse from his own stock to replace it, and the animal grew accustomed to the tunnel work the way the mule once had, hauling timber and gravel up the same worn path. By the 6th year, Widow's Bowl was Widow's Bowl in name only. Grass grew there now, thick and green even in dry months, fed by soil that no longer drowned every spring. Ruth had long since stopped thinking of the camp as a $9 folly and started thinking of it, quietly, as home, though she never used that word aloud, not being one for words she hadn't earned. It was in that 6th year that a family named Ostrander arrived from the east, having bought 40 acres bordering the old campsite unseen, and finding out only after the fact that the land backed up against a hollow with a history of flooding. The father, a broad, anxious man named Dale Ostrander, came to Ruth's door within his first week in the valley, half apologetic and half accusing, wanting to know if what he'd heard in town was true, that this ground drowned every spring, that he'd been sold worthless dirt. Ruth didn't argue with him any more than she'd argued with Kearns years before. She walked him up to the tunnel, now grown over with a decade of moss at its mouth, and showed him the channels, the pitch of them, the gravel packing, the water table stick with its faded pencil marks going back years. She showed him the flat stone where cinder was buried, right at the tunnel's edge, safe ground even in the worst spring anyone could remember. She told him about Elias Voss, a man neither of them had ever met, whose careful ink sketches had outlasted the mining camp he'd built them for by 2 decades and counting. Ostrander left that day still uneasy, as new men on new land tend to be, but he left believing, and that was different from being told. Josephine was 17 by then, near enough grown, and it was she who spent the following spring walking Ostrander's own low ground with him, marking where a smaller channel might be cut to spare his root cellar the worst of the runoff. She did the marking herself. Ruth watched from a distance and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. The 7th year brought a dry summer, the driest in memory, and where once the valley had feared flood, that season it feared drought instead. But the same channels that carried water away from Widow's Bowl in wet years held moisture in the ground through the dry one, feeding wells that other, ordinary land could not. Kearns, old now and slower, remarked once at the feed store that he didn't understand the trick of it. Water running off in a wet year, and somehow still there in a dry one, and nobody in earshot corrected him, because by then half the valley understood the trick of it perfectly well, even if they couldn't have drawn Voss's cross-sections themselves. Ruth turned 39 that autumn. She had kept her own journal since the 2nd year, separate from Voss's, recording her own measurements alongside his. The years she matched his flood predictions, the years she didn't, the corrections she'd made to his original design as the ground itself shifted with time. It had grown thick, the leather cover worn soft at the corners the way Voss's had been when she'd first found it. On a quiet evening in the 8th spring, with Josephine 19 now and married that same year to Ostrander's eldest son, settled on 40 acres of her own just south of the bowl, Ruth walked her out to the tunnel mouth one last time before the wedding took her permanently to the other side of the valley. She carried her own journal under one arm, the way she imagined Voss might once have carried his, and she set it in Josephine's hands the way the tin box had once been set in hers. She said very little. She never had been one for speeches. She told Josephine only that the numbers mattered more than the confidence behind them, that a channel cut wrong by even half an inch of pitch would fail no matter how sure the hands that cut it, and that the ground would tell the truth eventually, whether or not anyone was there to listen for it. Josephine opened the journal that night, in the small house she and her husband had built on their own low corner of the valley, and read through years of Ruth's careful hand. The flood of the 3rd year, the drought of the 7th, the boy pulled from the current, the dog buried at the tunnel mouth, the pitch of every channel cut and recut across a decade. On the final page, where Ruth had left room, Josephine took up her own pen for the first time, in her own hand, beneath Ruth's last entry. She wrote that the water always found the low ground, same as Voss had first written, same as Ruth had proven with her own hands. But where the old notebook had once warned that water always wins in the end, Josephine wrote instead, in the plain, unhurried hand of a woman who had grown up watching 2 flooded seasons pass without a single loss, that water didn't need to be beaten. It only needed somewhere honest to go.